Alaska, its wilderness is terrifying, but its small towns hide something far worse. Tonight on Midnight Whispers Stories, you'll hear 9 more disturbing true accounts that most Alaskans refuse to talk about. Voices rising from melting river ice, a vanished island that steals time, a figure on the Homer spit marking his next victim, and other horrors buried in the coldest corners of America. Stay until the end. There's a final warning you'll want to hear in the dark. Story 1. What the ice remembers. The ice spoke my daughter, its name 3 days before I learned she had drowned in that exact spot 20 years ago. I know how insane that sounds. I know what you are thinking right now. But I am a structural engineer, a man who deals in mathematics and physics, someone who built a career on understanding how the physical world works. And I am telling you that the ice on the Nenana River remembers things it should not remember, speaks in voices that belong to the dead, and knows secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. It started in late April when I took a contract job in Nenana, Alaska, a town of maybe 400 people that sits where the Nenana River meets the Tanana. Every year, the whole state watches this place during something called Ice Classic, a lottery based on when the ice will break up on the river. They set up a tripod on the frozen surface, attach it to a clock, and wait for spring thaw to drag it downstream and stop the timer. Millions of dollars riding on the exact moment ice becomes water. I was there to inspect a bridge, routine structural assessment after a harsh winter. Simple job, 2 weeks maximum. I rented a cabin on the river, showed up with my equipment and my coffee maker, ready for boring technical work and cold weather. The locals were friendly enough but quiet, the way people get in small towns when an outsider arrives. They watched me with careful eyes, especially when I mentioned my cabin was right on the riverbank. The ice was thick when I arrived, several feet of solid white stretching across the water, massive and seemingly permanent. But you could feel the tension in it, the way it groaned and shifted as temperatures climbed above freezing during the day. Spring breakup was coming, that violent transition when winter releases its grip and the frozen world tears itself apart. The first time I heard the voices, I thought it was the wind. I was standing on my cabin deck at sunset, watching the ice glow pink and orange in the dying light. The sounds drifted up from the frozen surface, faint but distinct. Murmuring, conversation, the rhythm of human speech but without clear words, like listening to people talk in another room through thick walls. I walked down to the riverbank and stood at the edge of the ice. The voices grew clearer but stranger. They spoke in a language I could not identify, syllables that felt wrong in my ears, consonants and vowels arranged in patterns that made my head hurt. And beneath the words ran emotional tones I understood perfectly. Anger, fear, desperation. The universal sounds of people arguing, pleading, fighting. The ice cracked as I stood there, a sharp report like a gunshot that made me jump back from the edge. The crack spread across the surface in jagged patterns, and for just a moment, I swear I saw shapes in those fracture lines. Faces, dozens of faces pressed against the underside of the ice, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and desperate. I blinked and they were gone. Just tricks of light and shadow. Pareidolia, the human brain, its tendency to see faces in random patterns. I laughed at myself, embarrassed by my own imagination, and went back inside to make dinner. But that night, I heard them again. Voices rising from the river, clearer now, no longer muffled by distance or ice. They spoke in English this time, fragments of conversation that made no sense. A woman asking about her children, a man describing cold, endless cold, begging for warmth. A child counting numbers in a sing-song voice, counting up and up with no end. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was thermal expansion making the ice crack, that my brain was interpreting random sounds as speech. But the voices continued night after night, growing louder, more insistent, more varied. Different languages, different dialects, different time periods all jumbled together. I heard Russian, native Athabascan, English with accents from a century ago. And underneath it all, that strange unknown language, those syllables that hurt to hear. I asked the locals about it, mentioned casually that the ice made interesting sounds at night. They got that look again, that careful wariness, and changed the subject quickly. The bartender at the only bar in town told me I should move to a hotel, that the river was unpredictable during breakup, that cabins on the bank were not safe. But his eyes said something different. He was not worried about flooding. He was worried about something else. I found the records at the town library, old newspapers and historical documents. Nenana had been a transportation hub during the gold rush and after, a place where the railroad met the river, where freight got transferred from train to boat. Thousands of people had passed through over the decades, and some of them never left. The Nenana River was notorious for drownings, workers who fell through ice, boats that capsized during breakup, children who wandered too close to the edge. The numbers were staggering, far higher than you would expect for a river this size. Dozens of documented deaths going back over 100 years, and probably many more that were never recorded. And there were other stories, stranger stories, that appeared in old journals and letters but never made the official histories. Stories about voices in the ice, about the dead speaking during spring breakup, about the river remembering everything that had ever happened on its surface, storing memories in frozen water like data in a hard drive, releasing them when the ice began to melt. One account from 1923, written by a railway worker, described hearing his dead brother, his voice calling from the ice. The brother had drowned the previous winter, body never recovered. The railway worker went out onto the ice following that voice and fell through a weak spot. They found him 2 days later, frozen under 3 feet of solid ice, his face locked in an expression of horror and recognition. I should have left, should have packed my equipment and driven back to Anchorage immediately. But I was nearly done with the bridge inspection, just a few more days of work. And I will admit, part of me was fascinated. The engineer in me wanted to understand the mechanism, to find a rational explanation for sounds that seemed impossible. The voices got worse as the weather warmed. The ice began its final transformation, groaning and cracking constantly, whole sections heaving upward or collapsing inward as the river beneath fought to break free. And with each crack, with each shift, the voices grew clearer, more desperate, more demanding. They started calling specific names, people who lived in town, historical figures, and then, on the third night of true breakup, when the ice had fractured into a maze of floating chunks, they called my name. Not just my name, my full name, middle name included, in a voice I recognized. My ex-wife Amanda, who I had not spoken to in 15 years. She said my name the way she used to say it, with that particular inflection she had, and then she said something that stopped my heart. She told me about Emma, about our daughter, the daughter I did not know I had. Amanda had gotten pregnant just before we separated, had never told me, had raised Emma alone. And Emma had died, drowned, in the Nenana River 20 years ago during spring breakup, when Amanda brought her to Alaska for a job and let her play too close to the ice. The voice from the river gave me details. Emma's birthday, her favorite color, the scar on her knee from a bicycle accident. Details I could not know, should not know, that could only be true if the impossible was happening. If the dead were actually speaking through the ice. I called Amanda that night, the first time in 15 years. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice wary and confused. I asked about Emma. The silence that followed was the worst sound I have ever heard. Then she started crying, asking me how I knew, how I possibly could have known about Emma when she had never told anyone I was the father. Emma had drowned in Nenana in 2004, 20 years old, visiting Alaska for the first time. She had been standing on the riverbank during breakup, watching the ice, when a massive chunk shifted and created a wave that pulled her in. They found her body 3 days later, trapped under the ice downstream. Amanda had scattered her ashes in the same river that took her, unable to let go, unable to leave Nenana without leaving part of Emma behind. I went down to the river after that call. The breakup was reaching its peak. Ice chunks the size of cars grinding past, the water brown with silt and violence. And I heard Emma's voice, my daughter's voice, calling from the chaos. She sounded young, scared, asking for her father, asking why he never came to find her. The ice remembers everything. That is what I understand now. Every person who died in that water, every moment of fear and pain and desperate final thoughts, all of it stored somehow in the structure of frozen water molecules, locked away during the long winter. And when spring comes, when the ice breaks and reforms and breaks again, those memories are released, played back like recordings, voices of the dead speaking to the living. But it is worse than that. The ice does not just remember the past. It pulls at the present. It calls to people, lures them down to the water's edge, whispers promises of reunion with the law. And people listen. People follow those voices out onto unstable ice, into rushing water, joining the chorus of the drowned. I watched it happen on the 5th night. A man from town, maybe 50 years old, walked past my cabin toward the river. His eyes were distant, empty, his face slack. He stepped onto a floating ice chunk without hesitation, and it tipped immediately, dumping him into the freezing water. I ran to help, called for assistance, but the current took him fast, pulled him under the ice where I could not follow. They found his body the next morning, and that night, I heard his voice joining the others, confused and angry, asking why he had gone into the water, saying he heard his mother calling, that she told him to come find her. The pattern was clear then. The ice called and people answered. Spring after spring, breakup after breakup, the Nenana River claimed new victims who became new voices for the next year, his thought. A cycle that had been repeating for generations, hidden in plain sight, dismissed as accidents or foolishness or bad luck. I hear Emma every night now. She calls for me, asks me to come to the river, tells me she is cold and scared and needs her father. The pull is overwhelming, the need to go to her, to finally meet my daughter, to apologize for not being there, for not knowing she existed. My rational mind knows it is not really Emma, just an echo, a recording, a trap. But my heart does not care about rational explanations. The ice is mostly gone now. Breakup is complete for another year. The river runs fast and free, brown water churning over the places where ice used to be. But I still hear the voices. They come from the water itself now, from the spray and splash, from the rush over rocks. Quieter but still present, still calling, still hungry for company. I am leaving Nenana tomorrow. Finished my bridge inspection 5 days ago but could not make myself drive away. Every night I stand on my cabin deck and listen to my daughter, this voice asking me to join her in the water. Every night I step closer to the edge. I do not know if I will make it out. The pull is so strong, the need to finally know Emma, to hold her and tell her I'm sorry I was not there. Part of me knows that going to her means death, means joining that chorus of drowning voices. But another part, the part that has grown louder each day, whispers that drowning is not ending but beginning. That the ice will remember me too, will preserve my voice and my love, will let me speak to Emma forever in that strange space between frozen and flowing. If you are listening to this recording, if someone finds my notes after I am gone, then you know I did not resist. You know, the river took me like it has taken so many others. And next spring, during breakup, if you visit Nenana, you might hear my voice mixed with all the others, calling from the ice, pleading and arguing and counting in languages living and dead. Stay away from the river during spring thaw. Do not listen to the voices, no matter whose voice you hear, no matter how much you want to believe the impossible. The ice remembers everything, but memory is not life. The voices are not really the people we lost. They are just echoes, recordings, traps set by something old and patient and hungry. But even knowing that, even understanding the danger, I cannot stop myself from walking toward the water. Emma is calling. My daughter needs me. And after 20 years of not knowing she existed, of missing her entire life, how can I refuse to go to her now? The ice remembers, and soon it will remember me too, and my voice will join the chorus, calling to other fathers, other parents, other people who loved and lost. We will all speak together when the river breaks, our words frozen and preserved, our warnings ignored by those who hear exactly what they want to hear. It is almost dawn. The water is calling. Emma is calling. And I am so tired of resisting, so tired of being alone, so ready to learn what the ice knows, what secrets are locked in frozen memory. I am going to the river now. And if you ever hear a voice calling from the Nenana ice, speaking your name, promising reunion with someone you lost, remember this story. Remember that the ice lies with truths, that it offers real memories as bait for a trap that has no bottom. But remember too that knowing the danger does not make us immune. We are all just one voice away from walking into the water, from joining the chorus, from becoming what the ice remembers forever. Story 2. Gustavus Forgotten Island. There is an island in Icy Strait that doesn't appear on any modern map, but it has been there for over 100 years. Some seasons it exists, some seasons it vanishes completely. And I know this because I landed on it 3 months ago. And I'm still not entirely sure I ever left. My name is Robert, and I am a commercial fishing captain based out of Gustavus, Alaska. I've worked these waters for 27 years. I know every current, every hidden reef, every dangerous stretch of Icy Strait. I've made this journey hundreds of times. But on the day I saw the island, I knew immediately that something was wrong. something terrifying and profoundly unsettling about what appeared before me in the fog. I was heading back to port after a successful day of fishing, my nets heavy with halibut, the evening light fading toward the endless Alaskan dusk. The weather had been deteriorating all afternoon, fog rolling in from the ocean, reducing visibility to maybe 100 yards. I had my GPS, my radio, all the modern navigation tools. But GPS can fail, and radios can go silent. The island appeared suddenly on my port side, materializing out of the fog like a memory becoming solid. I checked my instruments immediately. According to my GPS, there was nothing there. According to my navigation charts, this coordinate was empty water. But my eyes were telling me something completely different. The island was small, maybe a quarter-mile across, with dense forest covering most of its interior. A rocky beach faced the water, and along that beach, I could see the weathered wooden structures of buildings. Old buildings, the kind of creepy, eerie architecture that looked like it belonged to another era entirely. I was curious, I admit that. I was curious in the way that a fisherman gets curious about unusual sightings, strange phenomena, things that don't make logical sense in a world that is supposed to be thoroughly mapped and understood. So I cut my engines and launched my small skiff, intending to investigate for maybe 10 minutes, just long enough to satisfy my curiosity about these mysterious structures. The fog grew thicker as I approached the island, wrapping around my boat like something alive, something that wanted to obscure my vision and separate me from the water and the known world. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath became visible, small clouds of vapor in the increasingly cold air. The water around my skiff became black and still, no waves, no current, as if I had drifted into some pocket of absolute stillness. When my boat touched the rocky beach, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to turn back. The fog had closed in completely now, and my skiff suddenly felt very small and very insignificant against the darkness and the eerie, unsettling silence of this impossible place. I pulled my boat onto the beach and began walking toward the structures. The buildings were made of weathered wood, the paint peeling off in long strips, revealing the gray timber beneath. The architecture was distinctive, clearly early 20th century. These weren't modern structures. These were authentic old buildings, and they had been sitting on this island for decades, possibly for a century or more. The main building appeared to be a general store. The windows were dark and empty, the door hanging slightly open, creaking in the wind. I pushed it wider and stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The shelves were still stocked with merchandise. Canned goods with faded labels, bottles of medicine with names I didn't recognize. Old newspapers piled in the corners, the headlines discussing events from the 1910s. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the merchandise was perfectly preserved. No rust, no decay, no signs of the passage of time beyond the dust itself. It was as if the store had been frozen at some point in history and suspended in this moment, waiting for customers who would never return. I spent what I thought was maybe 30 minutes exploring the island. I found a schoolhouse with a chalkboard still covered in arithmetic lessons. I found a small church with a Bible open to a particular passage, as if someone had been reading just moments before the world stopped. I found a home with the table still set for dinner, the food long since turned to dust, but the plates and glasses arranged exactly as they had been when the meal was abandoned. The most disturbing discovery was in one of the homes. A journal, sitting on a desk, the entries dating from 1914. The handwriting was shaky and increasingly incoherent as the entries progressed. The final entry, dated December 23, 1914, read only, "They are here. They have always been here. We were never supposed to leave." I left the journal where I found it and rushed back to my boat. The fear was building in my chest. A cold, creeping dread that something about this place was fundamentally wrong, fundamentally terrifying. The fog was thicker than ever, pressing down on me, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. When I reached my boat, I realized something horrifying. My watch showed that only 30 minutes had passed since I arrived. But the light was completely gone now. It should have been early evening when I landed. Now it was full darkness, the kind of complete, consuming darkness that only comes in the deep of night. I got the boat started and headed toward where I believed open water should be. The fog was so thick that I was essentially blind, navigating by dead reckoning and hope. For what felt like hours, I motored through that gray, creepy, unsettling murk, expecting at any moment to hit rocks or run aground. But somehow I made it through, breaking out of the fog into open water under stars that seemed too bright, too numerous, positioned in configurations that I didn't recognize. My GPS had stopped working completely. My radio was picking up nothing but static. My instruments showed readings that made no sense. But gradually, as I made my way by the stars, I began to recognize landmarks. I could see the distant lights of Gustavus on the horizon. I could see the channel that would lead me to port. When I pulled into the harbor, I was disoriented and terrified, but I was home. I checked my watch. According to it, I had been gone for exactly 4 hours. That was impossible. I had been on that island for at least 6 to 8 hours. The sun had been setting when I arrived, and it was now 10 o'clock at night. The math didn't add up. But what happened next was even more disturbing. When I called the harbor master to report my position, he seemed confused. He didn't have me on radar. He didn't have any record of my departure that morning. When I asked what day it was, he told me. It was 3 days later than I thought. I had lost 3 entire days. The fear that seized me at that moment was paralyzing. I had no memory of 3 days. I had no idea what had happened to the time I couldn't account for. The only explanation was that something on that island had taken time from me, stolen it, consumed it in some way that I couldn't comprehend. I didn't go home immediately. I went to the harbor master's office and spent the entire night trying to find information about the island I had visited. The record showed no island in that location. There had never been an island there, according to every chart, every map, every piece of navigation data in existence. But the old records, the ones that went back to the early 1900s, told a different story. There had been an island. In 1914, a small settlement had been established there by a group of people from the lower 48, about 30 of them. They had set up a fishing and hunting camp with the intention of developing it into a permanent community. But the following spring, a trading ship arrived to check on them and found the settlement completely abandoned. All the buildings were intact. All the supplies were untouched. But there were no people. They had simply vanished. The official records noted that the island itself had disappeared after that point. It had been charted. It had been inhabited. And then it had ceased to exist in any measurable way. The only remaining documentation was a journal entry from the ship, as captain, which read, "The island is no longer there." We searched for it but found nothing. It is as if the entire place was never real, except that we have the buildings, locations marked in the measurements of the settlement. Something about this place defies natural explanation. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with the island. I spent hours in the library researching the original settlement, trying to understand what had happened to those 30 people. I found very little. The settlement had been poorly documented. The people who established it were largely unknown to history. The only detailed account came from a single survivor, a woman named Eleanor Hart, who had published a very short memoir in 1915. I tracked down a copy of her memoir. It was only 30 pages long, and most of it was devoted to the physical descriptions of the island and the buildings they constructed. But the final few pages contained a passage that made my blood run cold. She wrote, "We should never have stayed. We should have left while we still could. But the island made us forget why we wanted to leave. It filled our days with an unsettling, eerie sense of purpose and contentment, even as something fundamental inside us understood that we were trapped. Time moves differently there. Days become hours, become days again. And when you try to leave, when you actually manage to escape and return to the real world, you find that the time that seemed like days or hours has actually been months or years. Those of us who left are the lucky ones. The others never understood that leaving was possible." Eleanor Hart died in 1968, and her memoir was largely forgotten. But her account matched my experience so closely that I knew I wasn't imagining things. The island was real, the danger was real, and I had lost 3 days of my life to that impossible place. I tried to report my experience to the authorities, but they were dismissive. The Coast Guard investigated and found no island. My medical records showed no signs of trauma or psychosis. My fishing boat showed no evidence of unusual travel. According to every official measure, nothing unusual had happened to me. But I knew the truth, and I knew something else, something that Eleanor Hart had hinted at in her memoir. The island wasn't gone. It was still there, hiding in the fog and the currents of icy strait, appearing and disappearing according to some logic that had nothing to do with normal geography or navigation. Over the months that followed, I became aware of something horrifying. Other people in Gustavus were going missing. Fishermen, hunters, tourists, locals who ventured out on the water or into the forests surrounding the town. Most of them would eventually return, confused about time, unable to account for days or weeks or months that had passed without their knowledge. Some of them didn't return at all. Their boats were found empty, drifting in the waters near Gustavus. The Coast Guard classified them as maritime accidents, but I knew what had really happened. The island had claimed them. They were still there, frozen in the 1910s, living out their days in buildings that existed outside normal time and space. The most terrifying realization came to me about 2 months ago. I was reviewing the shipping manifests from 1914, the records of supplies being sent to the original settlement. The names of the 30 people who had been sent to that island were listed. I recognized some of them, not from history, but from current Gustavus. People I knew, people I had talked to, people who were supposed to have been dead for a century. The island was collecting people. It had always been collecting people, and time was meaningless to it. A fisherman who disappeared today might emerge from the fog in another 100 years, confused and disoriented, thinking that only a few hours had passed. The island was a trap, a terrifying, creepy, unsettling phenomenon that existed in some space between the normal world and something else entirely. I understand now what happened to me on that island. Those 3 days I lost weren't 3 days at all. I was trapped there for months. I lived in those buildings, lived in that frozen 1910 settlement, experiencing time in some way that my mind couldn't to properly comprehend. When I managed to escape, when I found my boat and drove it back through the fog, the island let me go because I had something the others didn't. I had a clock that was tied to the outside world. My watch had kept counting seconds in the normal way, and that had anchored me enough to find my way back. The others are still there. The original 30 settlers, the fishermen and hunters who have disappeared over the decades. And they were still alive, still conscious, still trapped in those buildings from the 1910s, experiencing an eerie, unsettling version of time that stretches and compresses in ways that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. Sometimes I see boats heading out into icy strait, heading toward where the island might be. I want to warn the people aboard. I want to tell them about the chilling, terrifying danger that waits in the fog. But who would believe me? I barely believe it myself. The forgotten island is still out there, hidden in the waters near Gustavus. On some days, when the fog rolls in and the light gets strange, I can see it on the horizon. The same buildings, the same weathered structures, the same eerie settlement from a time that should be long gone. And I am starting to notice something disturbing about myself. My watch has started to malfunction. Sometimes whole hours pass without me remembering them. I'll look up and realize I'm somewhere different from where I was a moment ago. The people around me seem to be aging at a rate that doesn't match my own experience of time. I think the island is calling me back. I think those 3 lost days created a connection that I can break. And I am terrified that soon, very soon, I won't be able to resist that call anymore. I'll find myself walking down to the harbor, getting into my boat, heading out into the fog toward that impossible, eerie, forever frozen place. And when I do, I think I'll finally understand what Eleanor Hart meant when she wrote "That Time Moves Differently" there. I'll understand it intimately and completely, in ways that will destroy my sanity or transform it into something that can actually comprehend such things. The forgotten island is waiting. It has always been waiting. And once it takes you, once you step onto its soil and enter its buildings, it never really lets you go. No matter how far you think they traveled back to the real world, no matter how convinced you are that they escaped, a part of you remains there, trapped in the darkness and the fog, waiting for the moment when you'll finally surrender to the pull and return to stay forever. 3 days. That's all it took for me. How long will it take for you? Story 3. Pointing Man. A terror in Homer spit. I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because if you ever find yourself in Homer, Alaska, you need to know what is waiting for you there. Not the kind of creepy legend that locals laugh about over coffee. This is real. This is terrifying. And this is what I saw. My name is Michael. I'm a normal guy, worked in construction, traveled occasionally, liked fishing. Nothing special. But 3 months ago, I took a job fixing up old commercial buildings in Homer, a small fishing town south of Anchorage. I drove down in early September, right when autumn was creeping in and the days started getting noticeably shorter. That is when I should have understood what was coming. When the darkness comes to Alaska, it comes with purpose. I rented a small cabin about a mile from the Homer Spit, that famous strip of land that juts out into Kachemak Bay like a finger pointing at something out in the water. The Spit is where the tourists go, where the charter fishing boats line up, where families walk and take pictures. It's supposed to be charming. It's supposed to be harmless. I had no idea what the Spit really was. No idea what was waiting there. The first week passed normally enough. I worked on the building during the day, grabbed dinner at local restaurants, walked around town in the evenings. Everything felt fine, normal, safe, but there was something about the people here. Whenever I mentioned the Spit, they got quiet. Their eyes shifted. They did quickly change the subject or find an excuse to leave the conversation. That's when I started noticing the pattern. Nobody walked the Spit after dark. Nobody. And when I asked why, the responses were always the same vague answers. Nothing out there worth seeing at night. Or, you don't want to be out there when it gets dark. I thought they were just being weird. Alaskan small town weirdness. But on my 11th day in Homer, everything changed. I was working late, finishing some wiring in the old building downtown, and I lost track of time. By the time I locked up and stepped outside, the sun was already gone and the darkness had settled in completely. I'd been working so late that I never really experienced Homer after dark before. The town felt different. The darkness here isn't like darkness in the lower 48. It's complete. It's heavy. It presses down on you from all sides, and the stars above seem impossibly far away, like they were mocking how far you are from any real civilization. I decided to take a walk before heading back to the cabin. Stupid decision. Terrifying decision. I wandered down toward the Spit, which was only a few blocks from the building, and I could smell the ocean, that thick salt smell mixed with something else. Something dead and rotting. The breeze was cold and sharp, cutting right through my jacket. As I got closer to the Spit, the streetlights became more spread out, leaving longer and longer stretches of complete darkness between them. My eyes were struggling to adjust. Then I saw him. Out on the Spit itself, maybe 200 yards away, there was a figure. Just standing there, perfectly still. I remember thinking how odd it was that anyone would be out here at this hour, especially in this cold. The figure was wearing what looked like yellow rain gear, a long yellow rain jacket and pants, the kind commercial fishermen wear. His outfit seemed to glow faintly in the scattered light, almost luminescent against the darkness around him. I should have just turned around and left. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to walk away. But something kept me watching. The figure was looking out at the water, not moving, not doing anything. Just standing there. The creepy feeling intensified as I stood there, watching him. The darkness felt heavier somehow, more alive, more aware of me. Then the man turned. He turned and looked directly at me. His face was too far away to see clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me. I could feel them boring into me from across that distance. He wasn't moving toward me, wasn't approaching me, just standing there looking at me. The silence was horrifying. No traffic sounds, no ambient city noise, just the faint lap of water against the shore and the wind moving through the buildings behind me. Then he raised his arm. He pointed at me with one long finger. I am not ashamed to say that my entire body went ice cold. This wasn't aggressive in an obvious way, but something about that pointing gesture was absolutely wrong. It was unnatural. No living person makes a movement that precise and deliberate and unsettling all at once. I wanted to look away, wanted to run, but I was frozen. I just stood there, watching him point at me from across the darkness. And then he lowered his arm and pointed at the water. One long arm pointing away from himself, toward the bay, toward the cold, dark water that stretched out into nothing. He held that point for several seconds, and I swear to God I felt something shift in the air around me. Fear isn't a strong enough word for what I felt. It was primal. It was the kind of fear you feel when you understand, on some deep level, that something is very wrong with reality. That's something I isn't right about what you were witnessing. My legs finally obeyed my brain's command to move. I turned and walked away, fast at first, then faster. Then I was almost running back toward the lights of downtown Homer. I didn't look back. I wouldn't let myself look back. Every step I took away from the spit, I felt exposed, like I was being watched by something that had marked me, something that knew exactly who I was now. I made it back to my car and drove to the cabin with my hands shaking so badly I almost hit a mailbox turning into the driveway. I spent the entire night inside, lights on, checking and rechecking that the doors were locked. I tried to convince myself that it was just some drunk fisherman or someone messing with me. But I knew that wasn't the truth. I knew that what I witnessed wasn't normal. It wasn't explainable. And that made it infinitely more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The next morning, in daylight, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I let my imagination run away with me. It was just some fisherman, probably a local doing some kind of weird prank. I went back to work and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. Every moment of that encounter kept playing back in my mind. The way he moved, the way he pointed, the absolute certainty that something deeply disturbing had just happened. I decided to ask around about the figure in yellow. Nothing direct. I didn't want people to think I was crazy. I just started asking casual questions. Had anyone ever seen a fisherman in yellow rain gear working at night on the spit? Was there anyone local who always wore the same outfit? The reactions I got were chilling. People would get quiet and uncomfortable. One waitress at a diner actually put her hand on my arm and told me not to talk about it, that it was bad luck to acknowledge him. Bad luck? As if the mere act of speaking about this thing could bring something terrible down on my head. A construction worker I met mentioned, very quietly, that sometimes people went out on the spit at night and didn't come back right away. There have been disappearances over the years. Fishermen mostly, people who ignored the warnings about staying away from the spit after dark. But here is the thing about small towns. They don't voluntarily give you information. You have to piece it together from half-spoken sentences and things people don't say rather than things they do say. After 3 days of careful listening and noticing what topics made people uncomfortable, I started to form a picture. There was something about this figure in yellow. He'd been appearing for at least 20 years, maybe longer. Nobody knew who he was or where he came from. He always appeared out on the spit, always at night, always wearing the same yellow rain gear. And the worst part, there was a definite pattern to his appearances. He would appear to someone, point at them, then point at the water. And then, within a few days, something bad would happen to that person. Sometimes they die. Sometimes they disappear entirely. And sometimes they survive, but something fundamental about them would be broken forever. They'd become hollow somehow, emotionally destroyed, like the life had been drained right out of them. I was sitting in the cabin, absorbing all of this horrifying information, when I realized something that made my blood turn to ice water. It had been 2 days since I saw the pointing man. 2 days, and no logical explanation came to mind for what was going to happen to me. Was I going to die? Was I going to disappear? Was something terrible going to come into my life and destroy everything I built? The nightmare of not knowing was almost as bad as the terrifying encounter itself. The third night after my encounter, I decided I had to go back. I know that sounds insane, but I couldn't help myself. Some part of me needed to understand what was happening, needed to confront this thing, needed to do something other than just wait for whatever dark fate was approaching. I drove back to the spit around 8 o'clock in the evening. The sun had already set, and the darkness was settling in fast. There was no wind tonight. The bay was completely still, like glass, and the darkness was so complete it felt like staring into nothing at all. I walked out onto the spit, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam felt fragile somehow, like it could be swallowed by the darkness at any moment. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every shadow, every sound, every movement was magnified into something that felt dangerous and threatening. And then I saw him again. He was out near the end of the spit this time, standing at the very edge where the wooden structure ended and the water began. The yellow rain gear seemed to glow in my flashlight beam, almost like it was emitting light rather than reflecting it. He was perfectly still, completely motionless. No living thing stands like that. No living person breathes so slowly that you can even see their chest moving. I forced myself to keep walking toward him. The wood of the spit felt slick under my feet, and I realized it was covered in a thin layer of moisture, or maybe something else. Something cold. I got closer, 20 yards away, then 15. I could see his face now, and I wish I couldn't. There was something profoundly wrong with his features. Not grotesque exactly, but unsettling in a way I can to quite describe. His face seemed slightly out of proportion, like someone had aged a photograph until it became something almost human, but not quite. And his eyes were empty, not just vacant, but genuinely empty, like there was nothing behind them except endless darkness. When he looked at me, it was like looking into two black holes that wanted to pull me in and swallow me forever. I tried to speak, tried to ask him who he was or what he wanted, but my voice wouldn't work. The fear had paralyzed my vocal cords completely. I just stood there, shaking, while this thing, and I knew now that it was a thing, not a person, stared at me with those hollow, terrible eyes. Then he slowly raised both arms. One pointed at me, the other pointed at the water. And in that moment, something happened that I still can't fully explain. I felt a presence in my mind. Not a voice, but a knowing. A sudden and absolute understanding that had nothing to do with hearing or seeing. I understood, in that instant, that this creature, this fisherman in yellow rain gear, had died in these waters. He drowned out in Kachemak Bay decades ago, and whatever had happened to him had left him trapped here, unable to move on, condemned to repeat the same action over and over again. He wasn't attacking me or threatening me. He was warning me. He was trying to tell me something about the water, about what was down there in the darkness beneath the surface. And suddenly, I knew with absolute certainty that I was never supposed to have looked into his eyes. Something had transferred from him to me, some knowledge or curse or understanding that I was never meant to possess. The darkness in those eyes wasn't empty at all. It was full of something ancient and hungry and wrong. I ran. I don't remember running, but I must have, because suddenly I was back in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I drove back to the cabin and spent the night pacing and drinking bad coffee and trying desperately not to think about what I'd seen. But here is where this becomes truly terrifying, because I'm sitting here now, 3 months later, in my apartment in Phoenix, far away from Homer, far away from Alaska, far away from that horrible spit. And I can't stop seeing his face. I can't stop thinking about what I understood when I looked into his eyes. Every time I am near water now, every time I take a shower, every time I drive past a lake or a swimming pool, I feel this overwhelming sense of dread and wrongness. The worst part is that I feel him still watching me, even from thousands of miles away, even in this city surrounded by desert and heat and light. I feel his presence. It's like he marked me when he pointed at me that first night. And I think he is waiting for something. I don't know it, but I can feel it coming. Something is changing in me. My dreams have become nightmarish. I wake up covered in sweat, gasping for breath, and I have vague memories of drowning over and over again in black water. Last week, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. No words, just a photograph. It was a picture of the Homer Spit taken at night. The photograph was grainy and dark, but in the center, standing at the very edge of the dock, was a figure in yellow rain gear. And there was something else in the photo that made my blood freeze. In the background, near the water, I could just barely make out what looked like another figure. Standing in the water, waiting. I called the police, of course, but they had no way to trace the message. They suggested it was probably just a prank by someone local who heard I was asking about the spit. That is what they told me. But I know better. I can feel it now. The connection between me and that thing is getting stronger. Every night, my dreams get more vivid. Every night, I get closer to understanding what he is trying to show me. And I think I'm finally starting to understand why he pointed at the water. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. It was a promise, because I am starting to want to go back. I am starting to feel a pull toward Homer, toward the spit, toward the water. Some part of me now belongs to that place, and some part of me knows that one day soon, I'll have to go back. And when I do, I want to be coming back. I'll be joining him out there in that water, standing in the darkness, wearing yellow rain gear, waiting for the next person foolish enough to walk out on the spit at night. If you ever go to Homer, if you ever find yourself on the spit after the sun goes down, and you see a fisherman in yellow rain gear standing motionless in the darkness, Don, to do what I did. Don, to try to understand him. Don, to look into his eyes. Don, to let curiosity get the better of you. Because once you've seen him, once you've made that connection, you can never escape it. The darkness follows you. The water calls to you. And one day, when you are not paying attention, you'll find yourself walking toward it, unable to stop, drawn by something you can to fight or understand. That is the true terror of the spit spook. It's not that he'll kill you immediately. It's that he'll mark you. He'll become a part of you. And every day for the rest of your life, you'll feel yourself getting closer to the water, closer to him, closer to whatever waits in the darkness beneath the surface of Kachemak Bay. The creepy truth is that everyone he points at eventually returns. Everyone. It might take weeks, it might take years, but they all come back. And when they do, they wear yellow rain gear, and they stand at the edge of the dock, and they point at the next person who is foolish enough to walk out into the darkness. The horrifying cycle continues, an endless rotation of tortured souls, trapped in this eerie corner of Alaska, eternally bound to the water and the man who drowned there so long ago. This is the unsettling reality of Homer's spit. This is the nightmare that waits in the darkness. This is the terrifying truth that the locals knew all along. Story 4. McCarthy Mine Family. I heard a family having dinner 2,000 feet below the surface of an abandoned copper mine in McCarthy, Alaska. A woman laughed. A child asked for more bread. Silverware clinked against plates, but the mine has been sealed and empty for over 100 years, and the nearest living person was half a mile away. I knew what I heard was impossible, but I heard it anyway, echoing up through darkness and stone from somewhere deep in the earth where no one should be. My name is David, and I am a mining engineer doing contracted work for a preservation company studying the historic Kennecott copper mines. The company hired me to assess the structural integrity of the deepest shafts, to determine if any of the old workings could be safely preserved for tourists. I thought it would be straightforward work. Rappel down, take measurements, document what I found, get paid, and move on. The McCarthy mines are a haunting reminder of early 20th century industrial America. The town exists now as a ghost of itself, a handful of buildings clinging to the landscape, surrounded by the massive industrial skeleton of the old mining operation. The Kennecott mines were once the richest copper mines in North America. But by the 1930s, the ore had been exhausted, and the operation was abandoned. I arrived in McCarthy on a cold October morning. The sky was gray, threatening snow. The town felt eerie, unsettling, like a place where people had lived once but had been utterly scrubbed away by time. The locals looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret when I mentioned I was going into the mines. One old woman told me to listen to the sounds, but not to follow them. I didn't understand what she meant. The mine entrance was secured with a heavy chain-link fence, officially closed and off-limits to civilians. But I had the proper permits and credentials, and the lock was simple enough to bypass. I geared up with my rope, my headlamp, my safety equipment, and descended into the darkness. The shaft dropped vertically into shadow. My rope guided me down, and my headlamp cut through the blackness, illuminating stone walls covered in a thin layer of mineral deposits that glittered like frozen tears. The air grew colder as I descended, and the smell of minerals and old earth filled my nostrils. It was a familiar smell to anyone who has spent time in mines, but there was something else in it too. Something organic and unsettling. I reached the first level about 300 feet down. The old mine workings here were partially collapsed, timber supports rotting and failing after decades of neglect. I documented the damage with my camera and continued deeper. My assignment was to reach the deepest accessible shaft, roughly 2,000 feet down, to assess the feasibility of preserving that section. As I descended past the second level, past the third, I became aware of a quality to the silence. It wasn't the normal silence of an underground environment. There was something beneath it, a faint sound that I couldn't quite identify. The creepy, unsettling sensation that something was there in the darkness with me grew stronger. By the time I reached 500 feet, I could hear it clearly. The sound of a family dinner. The unmistakable clink of silverware against plates. A woman's voice, warm and familiar, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. A child's laughter, high and innocent. The scrape of a chair being pushed back. I stopped my descent and hung there in the darkness, my heart pounding. The sounds were coming from deeper in the mine, echoing up through the shaft. My logical mind raced through explanations. Some acoustic phenomenon, perhaps. A trick of echoing sounds from the town above, somehow traveling down through the rock. But I knew that was impossible. Sound didn't to travel that way. And besides, I could hear every detail with perfect clarity, as if I was standing just a few feet away from the family. I continued down, partly out of professional obligation and partly out of a morbid curiosity that I couldn't suppress. As I descended deeper, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. I could hear the clink of glasses now, the soft rustle of cloth, the creak of wooden chairs. I could hear multiple voices, at least 4 or 5 distinct tones, all engaged in what sounded like a normal family dinner conversation. At 1,000 feet down, I could almost understand the words. The woman was asking about someone, this day. A man, whose voice responded, deep and steady. The children laughed. There was a quality to the sounds that was deeply unsettling, profoundly wrong. The laughter was too perfect, too precisely spaced. The conversation flowed with an artificial rhythm that suggested it was being repeated, played over and over again like a recorded message. I reached 1,500 feet and anchored my rope to a stable section of the mine shaft wall. I needed to rest, to process what I was experiencing. The sounds from below were now so clear that I could distinguish individual voices, could almost understand the specific words being exchanged. There was the sound of food being chewed, of water being swallowed, of dishes being passed from hand to hand. My training and years of experience told me that this was impossible. Mines done to harbor families. 2,000 feet of solid rock shouldn't transmit sounds with such clarity. And yet, I was hearing it all with perfect, horrifying precision. I continued my descent, driven by a need to understand what was happening, to reach the source of the sounds. At 1,700 feet, I could see a faint glow from deeper in the mine. Not my headlamp, something else. A warm, orange light that seemed to be emanating from somewhere far below, somewhere that should have been in absolute darkness. The creepy, terrifying realization began to form that I was being drawn toward something deliberately. The sounds, the light, the entire phenomenon was orchestrated somehow. It was designed to pull me deeper, to make me descend further into the mine, to bring me closer to whatever was waiting in the darkness below. I forced myself to stop. I anchored my rope and took several minutes to compose myself. Whatever was happening, whatever I was experiencing, it was not something I could explain or understand through normal means. The fear that gripped me was primal, instinctive, the kind of fear that comes from deep in the brain, from the parts of human consciousness that understand danger on a level beyond rational thought. I decided to ascend. I would report what I had experienced to the preservation company and let them decide how to proceed. I turned my descent gear into ascent mode and began climbing back up toward the surface. But something was wrong. The rope felt slack in my hands. When I looked up, I realized that I had descended much further than I thought. The surface was now over 1,000 feet above me, and the darkness between me and the rope anchor was absolute and complete. The sounds from below grew louder. The family dinner was reaching some kind of climax. The conversation became more animated. The laughter grew louder, more frenzied. And underneath it all, I could hear something else now, something that sounded like footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me through the darkness of the mine. I rappelled faster, my hands burning against the rope, desperate to reach the surface before whatever was ascending from below could reach me. The sounds followed me, growing louder with each rope length I climbed. The footsteps were closer now, the breathing audible, the presence of the family unmistakable. By the time I reached the mine entrance and pulled myself out into the gray Alaskan day, I was screaming with a primal terror that I hadn't experienced since childhood. The rope, my equipment, everything was abandoned below. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from the mine and the unsettling, horrifying sounds that emanated from its depths. When the authorities found me on the road outside McCarthy, I was in shock. The local doctor said I had been coherent enough to explain my descent, my findings, and the sounds I had heard. But something about my story bothered everyone who listened to it. A researcher from the University of Alaska did some digging into the mine's history. She discovered that in 1920, a family of miners had been trapped in the deepest section of the Kennecott mine during a collapse. The father, mother, and 3 children had ventured into a sealed section of the mine to retrieve some equipment, and the entrance had collapsed behind them. The rescue effort was abandoned after 2 weeks. The family was presumed dead, their bodies never recovered, lost somewhere in the dark depths of the mine. But the researcher discovered something even more disturbing in the old newspaper accounts of the incident. The day after the family disappeared, people working in the mine reported hearing the sounds of a family dinner coming from the sealed section. The sounds were so clear, so distinct, that workers became convinced the family was still alive and somehow surviving in the sealed chamber. But all rescue efforts proved futile. The passage was completely blocked, and there was no way the family could have survived without air and supplies. Over the following weeks and months, the sounds persisted. Workers reported hearing the family dinner continuing night after night. The same sounds, repeated with mechanical precision. The clink of silverware, the child's laughter, the woman's voice asking about the day. It became so disturbing that eventually, miners refused to work in the lower sections of the mine. Within a year, the sound stopped being reported, and the mine was abandoned altogether. The locals in McCarthy know about the family in the mine. The old woman who warned me to listen but not follow had lost a grandfather to the mines. She knew the history. She knew what I would encounter if I descended deep enough. But she said nothing because no one ever believed the stories anyway. I spent the last 3 months trying to rationalize what I experienced. I convinced myself it was a combination of isolation, exhaustion, and acoustic phenomena that I don't yet understand. But I know the truth. I heard that family. They were real in whatever way things can be real in a sealed mine 2,000 feet below the surface of the earth. The scariest part is what the researcher told me at the end of her investigation. She said that every few years, someone descends into the Kennecott mines and reports the same phenomenon. The sounds grow louder and more insistent with each visitor. The family dinner is no longer just auditory. Recent reports mention seeing shadows moving in the darkness, seeing the faint glow of a family eating by lamplight in a chamber deep beneath the earth. And the most disturbing discovery was in the most recent accounts. The family sounds have been changing. There are now 5 voices instead of 4. A new voice, a man's voice, has been added to the dinner conversation. The family is growing. It is expanding to include visitors who descend into the darkness. I have nightmares about that mine. I hear the sounds even now, in places far away from McCarthy, in rooms with good light and other people around me. The family is calling. The dinner table is set. And somewhere in the deepest darkness of that abandoned copper mine, there is a place being saved for me, set with silverware and a plate, waiting for me to return and take my seat among them. The scariest thing is that I want to return. I think about it constantly. I wonder what the food tastes like. I wonder what the woman's face looks like. I wonder if the children know stories, if there is conversation, if there is some kind of life being lived in that terrible, unsettling place. The preservation company canceled my contract. They sealed the mine entrance permanently, posted guards, made it absolutely clear that no one is allowed to descend into the darkness anymore. But I know the mines. I know there are other entrances, other ways down, and I am becoming convinced that the family in the darkness wants me to find them. 3 months have passed since I heard them, and every night, I listen to the sounds that only I can hear. The clink of silverware, the laughter of children, the warm voice of a woman asking about my day, inviting me to come home, promising me a place at the table that has been waiting for me since the day the mine swallowed that family whole. The family in the mine is hungry, and they are getting closer to the surface with each passing day. Soon they won't need to call to people in the darkness anymore. Soon they'll be able to walk out into the light and invite visitors in person. And I suspect I'll be the first one who accepts the invitation. The mine is still waiting. The table is still set. And the family, patient and eternal, continues their dinner in the unsettling darkness, saving a place for the next guest who is brave or foolish enough to descend into the depths and join them. Story 5. Echo of Flight 8. Unalaska's haunting radio signal. There is a radio frequency in Unalaska that nobody talks about anymore. Not because it is secret, but because once you hear what comes through it, you can never unhear it. And I know this because I did. I heard it. And now I can sleep without thinking about 73 people trapped in a metal coffin at the bottom of the Bering Sea, screaming for help that will never come. My name is David, and I work as an air traffic controller at Dutch Harbor Airport in Unalaska, Alaska. It's not glamorous. Most days, I am monitoring small regional flights, cargo planes, and the occasional bush plane bringing supplies to remote villages scattered across the Aleutian Islands. The job is quiet, routine, safe, or at least it was until I started picking up a signal that should have died in 1953. I've been doing this job for 16 years. I know every frequency we use. I know the protocols. I know the pilots who regularly fly in and out of Dutch Harbor. And I know the emergencies that can happen in this part of the world. Engine failures over open water. Instrument failures in thick fog. Weather that comes out of nowhere and kills you within minutes. But nothing in my entire career prepared me for what I heard on a foggy September night that changed everything I thought I knew about this job. It started as a normal shift. The fog rolled in around 5 in the evening, the kind of thick, heavy fog that cuts visibility down to almost nothing. You can barely see your hand in front of your face when it's like that. The kind of fog that makes pilots nervous and makes my job harder because I have to guide them in by instruments alone. I was tracking a regional flight coming in from Anchorage when I heard it. At first, I thought my equipment was acting up. A crackling, static-filled sound underneath the normal radio traffic. Then the voice came through. It was a mayday call, but not from any of my aircraft. And not from today. The voice was distorted, layered with something that sounded like wind in terrible distance. But the words were clear enough. Mayday, mayday, this is Flight 8 Heavy. We are experiencing catastrophic engine failure. The number 2 engine is completely out. We are losing altitude rapidly. Request immediate assistance. I checked my screens. There was no Flight 8. There were no missing aircraft. Every plane in my airspace was accounted for and operating normally. But the voice kept coming, more frantic now, more desperate. The pilot was describing technical problems with aircraft systems I didn't even recognize. The language was old. The terminology belonged to another era. We cannot maintain altitude. The voice crackled. Instruments are failing. I cannot see the runway. The fog is too thick. We are going to crash. Can anyone hear us? We are going down. We are going down now. I did what any professional would do. I tried to respond. I asked for their location, their call sign, their aircraft type. But there was only static in response. Just wind and the deep, unsettling sound of an engine struggling to stay alive, followed by the voice again, now absolutely terrified, now absolutely knowing that death was seconds away. I reported it to my supervisor immediately. He listened to the playback and told me straight away that it was interference. Solar activity, radio waves bouncing off the atmosphere in weird ways. That happens sometimes in remote areas. It made sense. It should have made sense. But something deep in my gut told me that what I heard was an interference. It was a recording of a real event, somehow bleeding through from another time, another reality, another world where that plane was still crashing right now. The next night, the fog came back. Heavier this time, darker somehow. And as I sat in the control tower monitoring the approach of an evening flight, the same frequency came alive again. The same mayday call, the same distressed pilot, the same terrifying description of a doomed aircraft falling out of the sky. This time, I recognized something in the voice. An accent, a particular way of speaking that sounded like it came from the 1950s. And the call sign he was using, I looked it up during my break. Flight 8, flying from Anchorage to Dutch Harbor, crashed into the Bering Sea in November 1953. 73 people died. It was considered one of the worst aviation disasters in Alaskan history. Over the next week, the signal came back 7 times. Always when the fog rolled in thick. Always the same sequence. The initial mayday call, the growing panic, the realization setting in that they were not going to make it. Sometimes the voice would change slightly, like different pilots were taking the controls and making their final attempts to save the aircraft. Sometimes I could hear sounds in the background that made my skin crawl. The screams of passengers, the terrifying metallic groaning of a plane being torn apart by forces it wasn't designed to withstand. I started researching the crash. Obsessively. I found old newspaper archives. I found aviation reports. I found the manifest listing every single person who died that day. Among them were businessmen heading to mining operations, military personnel, and a group of missionaries traveling to establish a church in a remote village. 73 lives erased in an instant when the aircraft slammed into dark, freezing water in the middle of nowhere. But here is where this becomes truly terrifying. The more I listened to the mayday calls, the more I realized something impossible. The voice in the radio wasn't just replaying the crash over and over. It was responding to me. When I asked questions, there would be subtle variations in the responses. When I didn't respond, the signal grew more frantic, like whoever was calling was desperately trying to communicate with someone, anyone, in the present day. One night, I asked a question directly into the radio. I wasn't supposed to. Protocol says you never speak directly to unknown signals. But the fear had gotten to me by then. The creepy feeling that something was trying to reach me specifically was overwhelming. I asked, "Can you hear me? If you can hear me, respond." The static cleared, the wind noise faded, and then the voice came through so clearly it sounded like the pilot was standing right next to me in the control tower. "Yes, I hear you. Finally, someone hears me. We have been calling for so long. So very long. Can you help us?" My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the microphone. I asked him where he was, what I could do, how I could help. The response came back in that same distant, layered voice. "We are in the water. We are always in the water. We crashed 70 years ago, but we never finished crashing. We are still falling. Still dying. Every time the fog comes heavy, we can reach through. We can call. We need someone to hear us. We need someone to help us finish." I don't remember hanging up the radio. I must have, because the next thing I remember, I was on the floor of the control tower with my supervisor standing over me, asking if I was okay, if I needed medical attention. I told him I was fine. Just tired, just stressed. I went home and I did not return to work for 3 days. But the signal never stopped. During those 3 days at home, I could hear it. Not on the radio, not in the control tower. In my head, a constant, quiet crackling sound, and underneath it, the voice calling my name. David, 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 over and over, like an unsettling nightmare that never ended. When I returned to work, my supervisor assigned me to a different section of the control room, away from the Mayday frequency. He said I'd been stressed about it too much, that I needed a break from monitoring that particular band. But the signal followed me. It came through every frequency. It came through the ground communications. It came through the weather radar system. No matter what I did, no matter where I went in that control tower, I could hear it. The pilots started reporting it too. Multiple flights mentioned strange radio interference. A voice calling out in English, but with an accent that belonged to another time. Pilots described hearing it during landing approaches, described how it unsettled them, made them anxious and paranoid. One pilot, a veteran with 30 years of experience, actually broke down crying after landing, saying he recognized the voice from his childhood. He was 11 years old when Flight 8 went down. His grandfather had been on that plane. I did something I shouldn't have done. I pulled the original accident investigation report from the National Transportation Safety Board archives. There were transcripts of the final radio communications from Flight 8. I read through them late at night, alone in my apartment, and as I read, I realized with growing horror that the Mayday calls I had been hearing were using exact phrases from those transcripts. Word for word, but also there were additions, new information, technical details that hadn't been public. Details only someone who was actually in that cockpit would know. The most chilling discovery came at the end of the report. The final transmission, which was cut off mid-sentence. The captain had been attempting to relay something. The transcription was incomplete, but there were several words recorded before the signal died. Words that haunted me. If anyone hears this, please remember us. Don't let us be forgotten. If we are forgotten, we will never, and then nothing. Just static and silence and the sound of that aircraft hitting water at terminal velocity. I started spending every fog night in the control tower, deliberately putting myself on the frequency with the signal. My supervisor eventually caught on to what I was doing and pulled me off active duty. He sent me to a psychiatrist, who prescribed medication and suggested I take a leave of absence. But I couldn't leave. Something was pulling me back. Something in that signal, in those voices, needed me to stay. One night, when the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen it, so thick that visibility was measured in feet, I made a decision that I knew was wrong even as I was making it. I took over the radio. I began broadcasting a message directly to that signal. I told the pilot that I remembered them. I told him that I had read the accident report. I told him that their names were recorded in history, that they would not be forgotten. I spoke each of the 73 names aloud into the microphone. It took over an hour. By the time I finished, there were tears streaming down my face and my voice was raw from speaking. And then something happened that changed everything. The signal didn't respond with screaming. It didn't respond with the sound of the crash. For the first time in weeks, the Mayday frequency went completely silent. Completely clear. And then, very quietly, a new voice came through. Not the pilot, a woman's voice. Calm, peaceful. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for speaking our names. We can rest now. We can finally let go." The signal faded. The static died. The voice disappeared like fog burning away in morning sunlight. I waited for hours, but it never came back. The frequency was just empty silence. Clean, peaceful, finished. I was fired the next day. My supervisor said I engaged in unauthorized use of control tower equipment, that I violated safety protocols and could have endangered aircraft. He was right, but he also knew something else. He knew that whatever had been happening on that frequency had stopped the moment I spoke those names. He knew that somehow what I'd done had mattered. Here is what terrifies me still. What haunts me every single day. I'm no longer in Alaska. I transferred to a control tower in Seattle. I work normal shifts over normal terrain with normal people, but every time the fog comes heavy, I hear it again. Very faint, very far away, but there, and it is a different call sign now, a different flight number, a different crash from a different time, and the voice is asking the same question that Flight 8 asked. Can anyone hear me? Does anyone remember us? Will anyone speak our names? I'm listening now, and I'm terrified of what I'm about to do. Because speaking those names worked once, and I know, with absolute certainty, that there are other voices waiting. Other doomed flights, other crashes spread across decades of Alaskan aviation history, and each one of them is screaming for help that I might be the only person able to provide. The eerie truth is that on Alaska, the skies are full of ghosts. Every airplane that ever went down over the Bering Sea is still crashing. Every pilot is still dying. Every passenger is still experiencing that final moment of terrifying realization that they will not survive. And when the fog comes heavy, they call out, hoping someone will hear them, hoping someone will remember them, hoping someone will finally give them peace. I stopped resisting it. They accepted that this is my role now, my burden. Every time a new signal comes through, every time a new voice calls out from the past, I listen. I record the names, I research the crashes, and when the fog comes thick enough, I speak those names back into the darkness, back across the gulf of years, hoping that each time, another voice will find rest. Hoping that someday, all the screaming will stop. But deep down, I know the truth. There will always be another signal. There will always be another voice calling from the water. And I will always answer. Because that is the terrifying price of hearing the echo of Flight 8. Once you start listening to the dead, you can never stop. Story 6. Red Snow, Kotzebue. This bleeding sky, I found something in the snow that should not exist. Something that doesn't make sense by any scientific measure, and yet it has been there, in the same place, for longer than anyone can remember. This is my confession. This is what I discovered when I moved to Kotzebue, Alaska, and what it cost me to understand the truth about the red snow. My name is Sarah. I am a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, and I was sent to Kotzebue for what should have been a routine assignment. Study some unusual mineral deposits north of town. Run some tests. File a report. Simple work. The kind of assignment that lets you see new places without much risk or complication. I thought moving to this small town at the edge of the Arctic would be quiet and uneventful. I was terribly, horrifyingly wrong. Kotzebue sits on a frozen peninsula in northwestern Alaska, surrounded by tundra and endless sky. The population is around 3,000 people, mostly Inuit who have lived in this region for thousands of years. It is beautiful in a harsh, remote way. Brutal in winter, but there is a strange peacefulness to it if you can get past the isolation. I arrived in October, just as the permanent darkness was settling in for the winter. The locals warned me immediately that I needed to be careful about venturing out into the snow. Not because of the cold, though that would kill me in minutes if I wasn't too prepared. But because of something else, something they spoke about in hushed tones and careful language, the red snow. Apparently, about 8 miles north of town, there is a patch of snow that never fully melts, and it is permanently stained a deep crimson color. It has been there for decades, maybe longer. Scientists from outside have tested it. They analyzed the samples. The results always came back the same: iron oxide, rust, something that oxidizes and creates a reddish stain in the snow. That's what the official explanation said. That's what the scientific reports concluded. But the locals knew something different. They knew something that the tests couldn't reveal. I became obsessed with seeing it for myself. My job was to study mineral deposits. After all, this seemed like exactly the kind of thing I should be examining. The locals tried to warn me away. An elder named Thomas, a man in his 80s who had lived in Kotzebue his entire life, pulled me aside one evening and told me not to go there. He said it in a way that made it clear this wasn't casual advice. This was serious. He told me the story of the red snow and what it meant. According to Thomas, the snow marked the place where the sky had bled. Decades ago, in the late 1960s, something happened in the sky above Kotzebue that was never properly explained. The locals saw it. They witnessed something terrifying that night. Something that didn't belong in this world. Something that descended from the darkness above and left behind this stain in the snow. A wound that never healed. A scar that wouldn't fade. Thomas wouldn't tell me exactly what it was. He said some things were better left unknown. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. But he begged me not to go out there. He told me that the patch of red snow wasn't just a geological oddity. It was a warning, a marker of something dangerous, something that still watched from the sky above that location. I thanked him for the warning and promptly ignored it. I was a scientist. I dealt in facts and evidence, not legends and folklore. I planned an expedition north to collect samples from the red snow patch and bring them back to my lab for detailed analysis. I would solve the mystery. I would prove that Thomas' story was just an old legend, nothing more. 3 weeks later, I set out on a snowmobile with enough equipment to spend several hours collecting samples. The sky was clear that day, which was unusual for Alaska in November. Clear and impossibly blue, the snow crunched under my boots as I walked, and the cold cut through my heavy parka like nothing I'd ever experienced. The landscape was utterly barren. No trees, no wildlife, just endless white stretching in every direction, broken only by the distant line where earth met sky. I found the red snow easily enough. It was exactly where Thomas had said it would be, a patch roughly the size of a city block, stained deep crimson. The color was uniform, consistent, almost deliberately placed. I knelt down and began collecting samples. The snow was cold and dry, and when I examined it closely, I could see the red pigmentation was throughout the entire deposit, not just on the surface. That is when I noticed the temperature anomaly. The patch of red snow was significantly warmer than the surrounding area. Not warm by normal standards, but measurably warmer. My instruments registered a difference of nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical explanation for why this particular patch of snow would maintain a consistently higher temperature than the surrounding tundra. Unless something beneath the snow was generating heat. I started digging carefully, removing the upper layer of red snow and setting it aside in sample bags. The deeper I dug, the more intense the red color became. And the warmer it got. I was about 2 feet down when I hit something solid, something that wasn't snow or ice, something hard and metal. My hands were shaking as I carefully cleared away the snow around the object. It was a fragment, a piece of something large that had impacted here. The metal was strange, not like any alloy I'd ever seen before. It was incredibly smooth, almost polished, and it had a faint luminescence to it even under the gray Arctic light. When I touched it, it was warm, genuinely warm in a way that made no sense given the temperature around it. I was so focused on the artifact that I didn't notice the sky had changed. When I finally looked up, I realized the clear blue had been replaced by clouds. Gray, heavy clouds that seemed to be moving in from nowhere, gathering with impossible speed. The wind had picked up too, though I hadn't felt it before. It now howled across the tundra with a sound that was almost like a voice. Almost like something was calling. I should have left right then. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stop what I was doing and get back to the snowmobile. But something held me there. Something about that metal fragment demanded my attention. I pulled it free from the snow, and the moment I held it in my hands, something terrible happened. The red snow began to glow. Not brightly, not obviously, but a faint, pulsing luminescence radiated from the patch. It started where I'd been digging and spread outward, a creeping red light that moved like blood seeping through white cloth. The glow was accompanied by a sound, a low-frequency hum that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. It was disturbing and deeply unsettling, like listening to something's heartbeat from inside their body. The clouds above darkened further. They swirled now, beginning to rotate in a slow spiral that made me dizzy to watch. In the center of that spiral, I could see something. A shape, a silhouette against the darker clouds. It was massive, the size of a building. And it was descending. I ran. I don't remember running back to the snowmobile. I don't remember the ride back to town. My memory of that journey is fragmented and nightmarish. I know that I didn't stop driving until I reached the outskirts of Kotzebue. I know that my equipment was scattered across the tundra. I know that I was screaming, though I don't remember making any sound consciously. When I finally stopped the snowmobile and looked back toward where I'd been, the sky was clearing. The clouds were dissipating. The wind was dying. The whole terrible event lasted maybe 3 minutes. But in those 3 minutes, I saw something that my brain still refuses to fully process. Thomas found me that night, sitting in my research station, staring at the metal fragment I managed to keep. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He just sat down and told me the rest of the story. 60 years ago, he said, the sky opened up. Not metaphorically, literally. Something came through it, something that didn't belong on Earth. Something that descended from the clouds and touched down on that patch of tundra. Hundreds of people saw it. The whole town witnessed it. But when the government came to investigate the next day, there was nothing to find. No crash site, no debris, just the red snow, staining the ground with something that tests said was iron oxide, but everyone knew was something else entirely. The government came back many times over the years. Scientists and military personnel, they tested the snow, they dug into the ground. They found fragments here and there, always small, always strange. But they never found the main wreckage. Because, Thomas explained, most of whatever had come down that night was no longer here. It had gone back up into the sky where it had come from. But not all of it had gone back. Thomas believed that the thing that descended wasn't alone. That something had been left behind. Something was still there, beneath the red snow, waiting in the cold, dark ground. Watching, waiting for something. And every winter, when the darkness came and the snow piled up, it was closer to returning. I wanted to dismiss him. I wanted to explain everything scientifically. The metal fragment could be from a military experiment. The red snow could be some rare mineral deposit. The shape I saw in the clouds could have been an optical illusion, my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation and fear. But I held that metal fragment in my hands, and I knew better. It was real. The fear in my chest was real. The sense of something watching me was real. I spent the next 3 months conducting tests on the fragment. The results were impossible. The metal didn't match any element on the periodic table. Under magnification, its structure was too ordered, too perfect. It looked designed, manufactured, created by intelligence, and every time I held that fragment, my hands would start to shake. Every time I examined it closely, I would hear that low-frequency hum. Every time I studied it in the darkness of my lab, I felt like something was studying me back. I also started researching the incident from 1963. Official reports were sparse, but I found news articles, witness testimonies, government debriefing documents that had been declassified. They all said the same thing. Something came down from the sky. Hundreds of witnesses, military response, and then official explanation. Nothing. An unexplained phenomenon that was never explained. A mystery that was officially closed without resolution. The most chilling thing I discovered was a series of journal entries from a government scientist who had been sent to investigate the landing site in the days immediately following the event. His final entry, dated just before he was reassigned, contained only a few words. Words that terrified me. The snow is still warm. The snow grows deeper every year. Whatever came down did not fully come down. Parts of it are still above. Parts of it are still coming down. We don't. Do you know what it wants? We don't. Do you know how long we have? I left Kotzebue in January. I told my supervisors I was suffering from isolation psychosis, a common condition in extreme Arctic environments. I requested transfer to a warmer climate. I never told anyone about the metal fragment or what I really found. But here, this is what terrifies me now. Here, this is what haunts me every single day of my life. The metal fragment came with me. I couldn't leave it behind. Some part of me knew I needed to keep it safe, or keep it contained. I'm not sure which anymore. And every winter, when the darkness comes and the cold deepens, I feel it again. That hum, that sense of something watching, that knowledge that whatever descended on that patch of tundra in 1963 is still connected to this fragment. And that connection links directly to me. Last month, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the red snow patch in Kotzebue, photographed recently. But there was something new in the image. A second patch of red snow had appeared, 50 miles south of the original site, and the photograph was dated just 3 days before I received it. I know what's happening now. I understand the nightmare that Thomas tried to warn me about. Whatever came down that night is still coming down, still descending through the sky, piece by piece. And every winter, more patches of red snow appear. Every winter, The thing that bled from the sky gets closer to completing its arrival. The truly horrifying, the truly terrifying realization is that I don't think the red snow is the blood of the sky. I think it is a marker, a trail, a path that something is following to get here. And by taking that fragment, by studying it, by keeping it close to me, I've become a beacon, a target. I've marked myself as someone who understands, someone who knows the truth. The darkness is coming back to Kotzebue. And when it arrives completely, when all the pieces have finally descended through the bleeding sky, nobody will remember it as an invasion. Nobody will remember it as an attack, because this is not what it is. The red snow I sent to warning us of danger. It's marking our surrender. It's staining the world to show that we've already been chosen. We've already been claimed. And the sky will bleed again and again until the thing that descended in 1963 has finally finished its arrival. The truly chilling part is that I might be the only person alive who knows this is coming. And there is nothing I can do to stop it. Nothing I can do except wait and watch and listen for that low-frequency hum that grows louder every winter. The eerie truth is that the red snow never really melted at all. It just waits patiently beneath the surface, marking the places where something from beyond our world is taking root. And soon, very soon, it will bloom. Story 7. Wasilla Basement Polaroid. In 1998, a family in Wasilla, Alaska found a Polaroid photograph in their basement showing a complete stranger sleeping in their 8-year-old daughter's bed. The photograph was blurry, the face obscured, but the body positioning was unmistakable. Someone had been in their house, in their child's bedroom, taking pictures while she slept. The case went cold within months. The photograph was never identified, but the family knew something horrifying had happened in their home. Something that went far beyond a simple break-in or burglary. My name is Michael, and I was a detective with the Wasilla Police Department in 1998. I worked that case, and I could never stop thinking about what we found, what we couldn't explain, and what I believe is still happening in Wasilla to this day. This is my account of the investigation that changed how I understand fear, danger, and the terrifying capacity of darkness to hide things that should never exist. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late September. The family, the Mitchells, had discovered the photograph while cleaning out their basement. They had been looking for old Christmas decorations when they found it tucked behind a loose piece of paneling in the crawl space. The photograph was undated, but based on the furniture and the child's appearance, it was recent. Maybe within the last few months. When I examined the photograph at the station, my first instinct was skepticism. It was so blurry, the image so unclear, that it could have been anything. Maybe a family member taking a casual photograph. Maybe something that fell during renovations. But the quality of the Polaroid itself, the way it was hidden, suggested something far more sinister and deliberately creepy. The image showed a figure lying down, mostly obscured by blankets and shadow. But the position was unmistakably intimate. The figure was lying in the bed as if it belonged there, as if it was comfortable in that space. And most disturbing of all, the photograph had been taken from inside the bedroom, close enough to the bed to capture detail, close enough to suggest the photographer had been standing right over the sleeping child. I interviewed the family extensively. The Mitchells were normal people, not prone to drama or exaggeration. Their daughter, Sarah, was 8 years old, bright and articulate. She had no memory of anyone in her room, no recollection of being photographed. She said that sometimes she would wake up and feel like someone had just been in her room, but she could never remember anything specific. The feeling would fade by morning. The parents confirmed they had found the photograph location suspicious. Behind the paneling suggested someone had deliberately hidden it, wanted it found eventually, or intended it as a message. We searched the basement thoroughly but found nothing else. No signs of break-in, no footprints, no evidence of how someone could have accessed the house. I ordered a full forensic examination of the photograph. The police lab took weeks analyzing it. What they found was disturbing and ultimately baffling. The Polaroid was genuine, not manipulated. It had been taken on film from sometime in the previous 6 months based on chemical analysis. The image quality was consistent with a handheld camera, and there were faint fingerprints on the back of the photograph. But the fingerprints matched no one in any database. Not criminals, not registered citizens, not anyone who had ever been fingerprinted by law enforcement. It was as if someone who didn't officially exist had been in that house, in that child's bedroom, taking photographs in the darkness. I expanded the investigation. I checked for similar incidents in the surrounding areas. What I found was horrifying and deeply unsettling. Over the previous 2 years, there had been at least 7 other families report finding photographs they didn't recognize in their homes. All of them were Polaroids. All of them showed someone sleeping. All of them had been found in hidden locations, tucked behind paneling, in attic spaces, in basement crawl spaces. The authorities hadn't made a connection between the incidents because they had been reported to different departments, handled by different officers, classified as minor property violations rather than criminal activity. But once I started connecting the dots, the pattern became clear and absolutely terrifying. Someone was systematically entering homes in the greater Wasilla area, photographing sleeping people, and then hiding the photographs in the homes for the families to discover later. This wasn't burglary. It wasn't theft. It was something far more disturbing and fundamentally chilling. This was about access. This was about violation. This was about someone proving that they could be in someone's home, in their bedroom, in the most intimate spaces of their lives, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. I brought in the FBI. They reviewed all the evidence and came to the same conclusion I had reached. This was a serial intruder, someone with an unsettling compulsion to penetrate homes and document his presence. The fact that he was hiding the photographs suggested he wanted to be found, wanted the families to know what he had done, wanted to create psychological terror through the realization of violation. But finding him was impossible. There were no leads. The fingerprints matched no known criminal. The Polaroid showed no useful identifying information. The intruder was careful, deliberate, meticulous in avoiding detection. And most importantly, he seemed to know the layout of each home intimately. He never triggered alarms. He never left evidence. He entered and exited without a trace except for the photographs he deliberately left behind. After 3 months of investigation, the case stalled. Without leads, without suspects, without any way to identify the intruder, we had nowhere to go. The FBI assigned the case to a cold case unit. My involvement ended, and I moved on to other investigations. But I never stopped thinking about those photographs, about the families who knew someone had been in their homes, photographing them while they slept. Then, in early December, something terrifying happened. A family in Anchorage, about an hour north of Wasilla, discovered a Polaroid in their home. It showed a sleeping child. This family hadn't reported any break-ins. They hadn't noticed anything unusual. But the photograph was unmistakable. Someone had been in their home. Someone had been photographing their children. When the police brought in the photograph for analysis, the fingerprints on the back matched the fingerprints from the Wasilla photographs. It was the same person. The same intruder was expanding his range, moving to new areas, continuing his horrifying pattern of violation and psychological terror. I became obsessed with the case. I spent my own time reviewing the evidence, studying the photographs, trying to understand the psychology of someone who would do these things. The intruder wasn't stealing. He wasn't attacking. He was simply proving he could access people's most intimate spaces, photograph them without their knowledge or consent, and then leave evidence of his crimes to be discovered later. What made it even more terrifying was the implication of patience. If 7 families had discovered photographs, how many others hadn't found them yet? How many homes were being photographed but the pictures were never found? How many people had been documented while they slept, completely unaware that a stranger had been in their rooms? In January 1999, a breakthrough came. A family in Eagle River reported discovering a Polaroid, but this time they had a video security system in their basement. When the police reviewed the footage, they saw something. A shadow, a figure moving through the basement. The image was too distorted to identify, but it was undeniable proof of entry. The police used the timing of the video to narrow the search. They questioned contractors, utility workers, anyone who had legitimate reason to be in the homes during those time frames. But nothing led anywhere. The intruder had left no physical evidence beyond the Polaroids and the shadow on the video. What I remember most distinctly from that period was the fear that spread through Wasilla. People started installing security systems. They barricaded their homes. Parents would sleep in their children's rooms, unable to shake the terrifying knowledge that someone had been photographing their kids while they slept. The psychological toll was devastating. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the incident stopped. No new Polaroids were discovered. No new reports of intrusion. By mid-1999, The case had gone completely cold. The intruder had simply vanished, disappearing into the darkness as completely as he had emerged. But the case never left me. For over 20 years, they carried the weight of those unsolved incidents. The knowledge that we never identified him, never stopped him, never brought him to justice. The files are still sealed, the photographs are still in evidence, and the mystery remains completely, absolutely unresolved. Until last year, when I received an anonymous package in the mail. Inside was a Polaroid, not a photograph of someone sleeping, a photograph of me, in my own bedroom, sleeping in my own bed. The timestamp on the Polaroid suggested it had been taken within the previous week. The fear that seized me when I saw that photograph was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I was no longer an investigator observing a terrifying phenomenon from a distance. I was now a victim. Someone had been in my home. Someone had photographed me while I slept. Someone had sent me a message. I called my captain immediately. He contacted the FBI. An investigation began, but we all knew what the evidence would show. The fingerprints on the back of the photograph would match the fingerprints from 1998. The same person who had violated 17 families over the course of a year had now come for me. The chilling realization that came to me was that this wasn't random. This was deliberate. The intruder had photographed all those families. He had chosen each home carefully. He had documented each intrusion methodically. And after 20 years of silence, he had come back to photograph the detective who had investigated him. But here is what absolutely terrifies me. Here is what keeps me awake at night. The Polaroid that arrived at my house showed me sleeping in my bed in my current home, not my home from 1998. I moved 7 times in 20 years, always keeping my address private, always being careful about security. But the intruder found me. He knew where I lived. He had been in my home. I installed advanced security systems. I installed cameras in every room. I bought a firearm and started sleeping with it within arm's reach. But the fear never left, because I knew something that the initial families had learned through horrible experience. Once the intruder knows where you live, once he has documented you, there is nothing you can do to keep him out. 2 weeks after I received the Polaroid, another one arrived, this time showing me sleeping from a different angle, from a different night. The timestamp showed it was taken 2 days after the first photograph. While I was sleeping, while I had security systems active and alarms armed, someone had still been in my room, still photographing me, still proving that my defenses were worthless. I requested a transfer out of the department. I took early retirement. I left Alaska entirely. I moved to the lower 48, to a place where I thought I could start over, could escape the unsettling knowledge of what waits in the darkness in Wasilla. But the Polaroids keep arriving, sporadically, unpredictably. A photograph from 3 months ago, another from last month, always showing me sleeping, always showing angles that suggest he is getting closer, that he is taking more risks, that he is becoming bolder in his intrusion. I haven't slept properly in over a year. I take stimulants to stay awake, to deny him the opportunity to photograph me in sleep. But exhaustion eventually forces rest, and every time I close my eyes, I know that he might be there. Standing in my room, taking his photographs, documenting his access. The most horrifying aspect of this entire nightmare is that I understand now what he wanted. The Polaroids aren't threats. They were not messages of intent to harm. They were something far more terrifying. They were proof that he can access anywhere. Proof that he can penetrate any defense. Proof that the concept of privacy, of safety, of security in his own home is an illusion. The case files on the Wasilla incidents are still sealed, but I've made copies. I've shared the evidence with a researcher investigating serial intrusion cases. What they discovered is horrifying. The pattern suggests there may be others like him. Not copies of his work, but original perpetrators following a similar compulsion. The basement Polaroids might be part of a much larger phenomenon, a systemic intrusion into people's most intimate spaces that spans decades and affects hundreds of victims. And the most terrifying realization is this. How many people are being photographed right now and don't know it? How many homes are being accessed without triggering alarms? How many strangers are documenting people while they sleep? And the photographs are never found, never reported, never acknowledged. I am writing this as a confession and a warning. The intruder from Wasilla never stopped. He never disappeared. He simply evolved. He became smarter about hiding his work. He became more selective about his targets. And when the detective investigating him got too close to understanding the scope of the phenomenon, he turned his attention to me. I don't know how to stop him. I don't know how to keep him out of my home, out of my bedroom, out of my sleep. I just know that every time I close my eyes, he is waiting in the darkness. And somewhere in Wasilla, somewhere in Alaska, somewhere across the country, he is entering other homes, photographing other sleeping people, leaving his horrible evidence behind. The basement Polaroid is no longer just a cold case. It's an ongoing nightmare that I can wake up from. It's the knowledge that my home is not my sanctuary. It's the absolute certainty that I am being documented, being studied, being violated in the most intimate way possible. And he is still waiting, patient and methodical and absolutely terrifying, still proving, night after night, that he can be anywhere, that he can reach anyone, that nowhere is safe. Story 8, Swimming Dead. Knocking from the cold, I heard them knocking in the dark. Dead people, locked in a freezing shed, scratching and pounding from the inside, desperate and terrifying, asking to be let out. This is what I witnessed during my winter in the Kuskokwim region of Alaska, and this is the nightmare that I still cannot escape. My name is James. I am a writer, not a journalist, but I decided to spend a winter in a remote Alaskan village to research what I thought would be a book about frontier life and survival. I chose Kuskokwim because it was small, isolated, and authentic. Population maybe 800 people. The kind of place where modern life feels very far away and the old ways still matter. I had no idea that I was walking into something horrifying, something that contradicts everything we believe about death and the finality of it. I arrived in late September, just before the freeze truly set in. The village is accessible by boat in summer and early fall, but once the water freezes, you cut off from the rest of the world until spring. The locals knew this. They prepared for it methodically. They stocked supplies. They repaired buildings. They gathered firewood like people preparing for a siege. And they took the bodies to the holding shed. Do you understand what the holding shed was at first? I saw it when I was walking through the village in early October, a large corrugated metal structure on the edge of town, surrounded by a chain link fence. When I asked about it, the locals got uncomfortable. They explained it in careful, matter-of-fact language. In the Kuskokwim region, when people died during winter, the ground was too frozen to allow for burial. The earth turned hard as concrete. Digging a grave became impossible, so they kept the bodies in a holding shed, a cold storage facility where the bodies would remain until spring, when the permafrost thawed enough to allow burial. It was practical. It made sense given the environment. It was also deeply unsettling to me. I couldn't stop thinking about dead bodies stacked in a metal shed, waiting in the cold darkness for spring. But I told myself I was being squeamish. This was reality in the Arctic. This was how people had dealt with winter death for centuries. I should have listened to my instincts. The first hint that something was wrong came in early November. The northern lights became active that month. The aurora borealis. The sky turned green and purple and blue, rippling with ethereal light that was beautiful and hypnotic. The locals came outside to watch it, but I noticed something odd about their expressions. They weren't entirely happy. There was anticipation in their faces. Dread, like they were waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it. It came from the direction of the holding shed. A sound that didn't belong in the frozen silence of the Arctic night. A knocking. 3 distinct taps. Knock, knock, knock. Then a pause. Then it repeated. Knock, knock, knock. I thought I was imagining it at first. The wind could make strange sounds. Ice could crack and shift. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the pattern was too deliberate, too intentional. Someone, or something, was knocking from inside that shed. I asked the locals about it the next day. They gave me careful, non-committal answers. It was probably the wind, they said. It was probably the metal expanding and contracting in the cold. But I could see in their eyes that they knew exactly what the knocking was. They just didn't want to talk about it. Over the next week, the northern lights grew more intense. The sky blazed with color almost every night. And every single night, when the aurora was bright and active, the knocking came back. Knock, knock, knock. From inside the holding shed. From inside where the bodies were kept. I became obsessed with understanding what was happening. I started keeping a journal. I documented the times the knocking occurred, the intensity of the northern lights, the number of knocks in each sequence. I interviewed locals carefully, trying to get them to explain the terrifying reality of what I was hearing. Finally, An old woman named Martha broke down and told me the truth. The knocking had been happening for as long as anyone could remember. It started in the 1960s. According to village history, the first time anyone heard it, it was shocking and horrifying. A sound coming from the holding shed when the northern lights were bright. People rushed to open the shed and find out what was happening. They found the bodies exactly as they had left them. Cold, still, dead, but there were scratches on the inside of the shed. Fresh scratches, as if something had been clawing at the walls from the inside. At first, they thought it was an animal, some creature that had gotten into the shed, but searches revealed nothing. No animal, no intruder, just the bodies and the mysterious scratches. And the knocking continued. Over the decades, people stopped trying to understand it. They stopped opening the shed when the knocking started. They developed a kind of grim acceptance. When the northern lights were bright and the knocking started, you stayed inside. You didn't go near the shed. You waited for the lights to fade and the knocking to stop. And in the spring, when they opened the shed to remove the bodies for burial, everything was as it had been left. Nothing out of place, nothing explained. Martha told me something else, something that made my skin crawl. She said that the intensity of the knocking had been increasing over the years. It was louder now, more desperate, and it lasted longer each time the lights were bright. She said some people believed that whatever was doing the knocking was getting stronger, getting closer to actually breaking through. I asked her what she thought was causing it. She looked at me with eyes that held terrible knowledge, and she told me that the dead were moving. In the darkness and cold of the holding shed, sealed away from the world, the bodies were moving. They were trying to get out. The northern lights somehow triggered them, brought them to some terrible semblance of consciousness or animation. They weren't alive in any way we would understand it. But they weren't entirely dead either. I dismissed her theory. It was impossible. Bodies done. To move. Death is final. There had to be a logical explanation. An animal living in the shed, settling in the metal structure, creating the sounds. Wind moving through gaps in the construction. Something that made sense. But then the knocking changed. On a night when the northern lights were particularly intense, blazing across the sky in waves of brilliant green and purple, the knocking became something more. It became a pattern, a rhythm, almost like language. Knock, knock, knock. Long pause. Knock, knock. Pause. Knock, 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 knock. It went on for hours, and underneath the knocking, I heard something else. A sound like scratching, like fingernails dragging across metal, like something desperate trying to escape. I couldn't take it anymore. Against the advice of the locals, against my own fear, I decided to investigate the holding shed directly. I waited until just after midnight, when the northern lights were still bright but many people had gone to bed. I bundled up against the brutal cold and walked toward the fence that surrounded the shed. The closer I got, the more intense the fear became. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The scratching sound got louder, more frantic. The knocking became almost a banging now. Aggressive, desperate. Whatever was in there knew someone was outside. I climbed the fence and approached the shed door. It was padlocked from the outside. The lock was old, weathered, but solid. Through a gap in the metal wall, I tried to peer inside. The interior was dark, but I could see shapes. Long, still shapes. Bodies, wrapped around shelves. And there was movement, subtle but real. Limbs shifting, heads moving slightly, as if responding to my presence. The banging intensified. The whole shed seemed to vibrate with the force of whatever was inside trying to get out. And then I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice? Not clear, not distinct, but definitely a voice. Muffled and desperate, muffled by death and the cold and time, but unmistakably human. Begging, pleading, asking to be let out. I ran. I didn't remember the journey back to the small cabin I was renting. I just remember being inside, shaking, unable to process what I had just experienced. I told myself it was impossible. I had imagined the voice. My fear had created false sensory input. But I knew better. I had heard something that defied explanation. Over the next few days, I researched the phenomenon obsessively. I pulled up old medical literature about permafrost and its effects on bodies. I found theories about how extreme cold could slow decomposition almost completely, preserving biological tissue in a way that mimicked life. I looked for scientific explanations for sounds that could come from a building in extreme cold. But none of it explained the voices. None of it explained the deliberate knocking. None of it explained the intelligence behind the sounds. I found an old newspaper article from 1983, buried in the village archives. A researcher had come to study the holding shed phenomenon. He He brought sensitive audio equipment and recorded the sounds during a particularly bright aurora display. The article said his recordings had been inconclusive but troubling. It mentioned that he requested permission to open the shed and examine the bodies directly. Permission was denied by the village council. He left town shortly after, and the article hinted that he had been warned not to speak about his findings. I tried to find him online. His name was Dr. Robert Chen. He published several academic papers on permafrost and tissue preservation, but nothing after 1983. It was like he stopped researching the subject entirely. His final paper was titled simply, Anomalies in Preserved Biological Matter. A question rather than an answer. Martha found me at the general store and pulled me aside. She told me I needed to stop asking questions. She told me the village council was aware that I was investigating the shed, and they didn't appreciate it. She warned me that some things were meant to stay unknown. Some mysteries were meant to stay buried, and some doors were meant to stay locked. I tried to leave Kuskokwim early. I requested a charter plane to come pick me up, but weather prevented any flights for nearly 2 weeks. I was trapped, stuck in that small village with the terrible knowledge of what was happening in the holding shed. Stuck waiting for the northern lights to brighten again, knowing that when they did, the knocking would return. When the lights came back that weekend, I didn't stay inside. I went back to the shed. I needed to understand. I needed to face what was happening. I climbed the fence again and approached the door. The banging was immediate, aggressive, like whatever was inside knew I was coming back. I found myself reaching for the padlock. My hand moved without my conscious permission. Some part of me wanted to open it, wanted to see what was inside, wanted to understand the nature of what had been preserved in that cold darkness. But before I could touch the lock, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Marcus, the man who maintained the shed. He grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the door. He was strong, and I was too startled to resist. He dragged me back to the fence and forced me to leave. His expression was harder than anything I've ever seen. Not angry, terrified. He told me something that night that I will never forget. He said he cleaned the shed every few weeks, disposed of waste, maintained the temperature, checked the seals, and in all his years doing that job, he never told anyone what he sometimes found. Scratches inside the shed that hadn't been there before. Deep gouges in the metal, as if something had been clawing at it with incredible force. He found fingernails, human fingernails, scattered on the floor of the shed, broken and bloody, as if something had scratched itself raw trying to escape. But here is what truly terrified him, and what now terrifies me. The fingernails had blood on them. Fresh blood, not preserved and frozen like the rest of the bodies should be. Living blood, active blood, as if the body it came from was still alive, still trying to escape, still conscious enough to claw at its prison. I left Kuskokwim the moment the weather cleared. I haven't returned to Alaska since. I haven't tried to publish anything about what I experienced there. No book, no article, no confession until now, because I know what it would mean to go public with this. The village would deny everything. They would claim I was unstable. They would invoke privacy laws to prevent anyone from investigating the shed. But the terrifying truth is that I don't think what happens in Kuskokwim is unique. I think there are other small towns, other remote places, where bodies are stored in cold and darkness during winter. And I think in every one of those places, when the conditions are right and the northern lights are bright, something happens to those bodies. Something that we have no framework to understand. Something that suggests death might not be as final as we believe it to be. The most horrifying aspect is that I started having nightmares. In these dreams, I am in the holding shed. I am one of the bodies. I am conscious but completely paralyzed, locked in a metal coffin with dozens of other trapped souls. And the northern lights are bright. And we're all knocking, all desperately scratching, all trying to escape, all asking to be let out. I wake up with my fingernails bloody, even though I haven't moved in my sleep. I wake up hearing the knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Every time the sky is particularly clear at night. Every time I see even a hint of aurora activity reported on the news. The eerie sound follows me. The creepy, chilling reminder that something in that shed is still reaching out. Still trying to communicate. Sometimes, I wonder if opening that lock would have been a mercy. If letting them out would have ended whatever terrible half-existence they experience in that cold darkness. Or if it would have released something that should have stayed locked away forever. The nightmare that truly haunts me is not knowing which is true. The disturbing reality is that the dead in that holding shed might be more alive than any of us understand. and the darkness of that place. The unsettling knowledge of what lies there waiting through the long Arctic winter has followed me home and taken root in my mind where it will never leave. Story 9. Whittier Tunnel. I still don't know if what I experienced that night in Alaska was real, but I know what I saw, and I know I'm not the same person who drove into that tunnel. This is the true account of the most horrifying, unsettling thing that has ever happened to me, and I need to tell someone before the fear consumes me completely. It started on a cold October evening when I decided to drive through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel near Whittier, Alaska. I had driven through it 100 times before without incident. I thought it was just another drive. I was so terribly wrong. The tunnel stretches through solid rock for 2.5 miles beneath the mountains. There is nothing before it but endless highway and nothing after it but the small coastal town of Whittier. I always found it eerie, the way the darkness swallowed your headlights as soon as you entered. But that night felt different. That night, something was waiting. I was alone in my truck, windows up, heater running. The time was 11:30 at night. Hardly anyone used the tunnel that late. As I approached the entrance, I noticed the gates were opened wider than usual, hanging slightly askew like a mouth frozen mid-screen. That's when I felt the first chill that had nothing to do with the Alaska cold outside. The moment my truck crossed the threshold, my radio died. Not turned off, died. The speakers went silent, and the dashboard lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. I remember my heart starting to race. The tunnel walls pressed in on me, rough granite surfaces barely visible in my headlights. The air felt thicker in here, harder to breathe. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and accelerated slightly, wanting to get through the 2.5 miles as quickly as possible. That's when I saw the first figure. A woman stood on the right side of the tunnel, just standing there in the darkness, illuminated only by my headlights. She wore a dress from another era, maybe 1950s, and her skin looked pale, almost translucent. But the most disturbing thing was her face. Her expression was blank, completely devoid of emotion. Her eyes didn't follow my truck as I passed. They just stared straight ahead at nothing. I slammed on the brakes. My truck skidded slightly on the smooth tunnel floor. I looked in my rearview mirror, and she was gone. Not walking away, not fading. Simply gone, as if she had never existed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I convinced myself I had imagined it. Tired eyes playing tricks in the darkness. That's what I told myself. But I knew that wasn't true. I drove forward slowly now, every muscle in my body tense, every nerve screaming that something was terribly wrong. The tunnel seemed longer than I remembered. Much longer. I had been driving for what felt like 5 minutes, and according to my calculations, I should have been more than halfway through. My speedometer showed I was going 40 miles per hour. The math didn't add up, and that realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Then I saw another figure. This time it was a man, standing in the middle of the tunnel, directly in my path. He was translucent, like the woman, but his appearance was different. He wore old logging clothes, suspenders hanging loose, and his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. His jaw hung slack, and there was a darkness around his neck that might have been bruising or something far more horrifying. I swerved around him without thinking, my tires screaming against the tunnel floor. When I looked back, he was still there, still staring straight ahead with that same vacant expression. My breathing had become rapid and shallow. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly I thought I might crush it. This wasn't possible. This was a nightmare scenario. Something out of a creepy local legend told at a campfire. But I was awake. The cold air from the vents was real. The vibration of my engine was real. The terrifying, haunting fear coursing through my veins was absolutely, undeniably real. I pressed the accelerator harder. My truck surged forward into the darkness. The tunnel walls seemed to close in around me, getting narrower, the darkness thicker. My headlights illuminated only a small circle of gray concrete and stone. Everything beyond that narrow circle was absolute, consuming blackness. Then I heard it, a sound, a tapping on the side of my truck. Tap, 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 rhythmic, patient, deliberate, like fingernails on metal. I didn't slow down. I didn't look. I kept driving, but the tapping continued, moving along the side of my truck, from the rear quarter panel toward my window. That is when I saw the face. It pressed against my driver's side window. A woman's face, pale and wet. her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth open as if she was trying to scream silently. She was hitchhiking, or at least she had been, before something had happened to her. I could see that much from her expression. She had been waiting in this tunnel, and she had been waiting for a very long time. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, trying to put distance between myself and that horrifying visage, but my truck collided with the tunnel wall. The impact was violent, sending waves of pain through my shoulder. My headlights shattered, and suddenly I was driving blind, with only my parking lights to navigate by. The tapping continued on my window. Now it was frantic, desperate, accompanied by a sound like a low moan emanating from outside the truck. I realized that the voices in this place weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to communicate something, trying to warn me, trying to tell me something I desperately needed to know. I fumbled for my high beams, clicking them on despite the fact that my headlights were broken, hoping some light would reach the darkness around me. It didn't. The interior of the tunnel remained impenetrably dark beyond my small circle of illumination. I was driving blind through 2.5 miles of solid rock with whatever was haunting this place. My truck, its engine coughed and sputtered. I glanced at the fuel gauge and felt my stomach drop. The needle was on empty. Impossible. I had filled up before entering the tunnel. I knew I had, but the gauge didn't. To lie, the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before me now. I had been driving for 15 minutes, maybe 20. I should have been through it long ago. The realization began to dawn on me. Terrible and complete. I wasn't going to exit this tunnel. Not on the other side. Anyway, the figures appeared again, more of them now. They lined both sides of the tunnel. All of them translucent. All of them wearing clothing from different eras. Some from the 1900s. Some from decades past. All of them staring straight ahead with that same vacant, unsettling expression. There had to be 100 of them. Maybe more. They were hitchhikers, travelers, people who had driven into this tunnel and never driven out. My truck rolled to a stop. The engine had died. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening, terrifying. I sat in that darkness, surrounded by these spectral figures, and I understood the horrifying truth. This tunnel wasn't just a geographic location. It was something else entirely. A threshold, a holding place. Then, in the darkness ahead, I saw a light. Not my headlights, not anything normal. A sickly, pale blue luminescence that seemed to emanate from nothing at all. It was moving toward me slowly, methodically. As it drew closer, I could make out a form within it. A figure, larger than the others, moving through the tunnel with a purpose that was absolutely malevolent. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to remember. But I can tell you that when it reached my truck, when I saw its form outlined in that ethereal blue light, I understood that the figures standing all around me weren't the victims. They were something far more disturbing. They were part of something hungry. My truck doors locked by themselves. The windows fogged with a sudden condensation that felt ice cold. I heard the sound of something heavy leaning against the vehicle. Heard the groaning of metal under pressure. This was it. This was the end. But then I felt a jerk. A sudden violent motion, and my truck shot forward as if propelled by an invisible force. The tunnel walls were a blur, the spectral figures flashing past me in the darkness. I wasn't driving anymore. I was being driven, being expelled from something that had claimed thousands of travelers over the decades. I saw light ahead, real light, daylight, golden and warm and more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. I was approaching the exit of the tunnel, the town of Whittier just beyond. My truck burst through the gates into the bright Alaskan day, and I screamed. Not in relief, in absolute, primal horror, because I knew something had changed, something fundamental had shifted inside me. As I passed through those gates, I realized that I had left something behind in that tunnel, and something else had come out with me. Since that day, I've noticed things about myself that terrify me more than anything I experienced in the tunnel. Sometimes I catch my reflection in a window, and my expression is blank, vacant, just like the figures I saw. Sometimes I stand in the middle of a room without remembering how I got there. And most disturbing of all, I started noticing other people like me. People whose eyes are empty. People who exist but aren't quite present. Last week, I saw someone hitchhiking on the highway near the tunnel. When I passed them, their head turned with an unnatural, jerky motion to follow my truck. I could see their pale skin, their vacant eyes, their mouth open slightly as if they were trying to speak. I realized then that the tunnel I sent to trapping people, it was transforming them. And somewhere between that tunnel exit and now, if it becomes something I done to fully understand. I done to know if I'm still human. I done to know if I'm still alive or if I died in that tunnel and I'm just now realizing it. What I do know is this: the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel ISN to just haunted. It is hungry. And if you ever drive through Whittier, Alaska, and you find yourself approaching that tunnel entrance, those locked gates that barely hold back whatever waits inside, please, for your own sake, turn around. Because not everyone who enters that tunnel is trying to get to the other side. Some of them have been there for decades, watching the gates, waiting for new arrivals, existing in that dark, chilling space between worlds. And some of them, like me, have already left.